That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back in an all-new series on CBS All Access.
Imagine an episode of television so uncomfortable, so quietly explosive, that the network that made it decided the safest thing to do was pretend it never existed. Not edit it. Not apologize for it. Just erase it. That's exactly what happened to one installment of The Twilight Zone, a show already famous for pushing every boundary television had. For more than 5 decades, this single episode was kept out of reruns, left off syndication packages, and quietly excluded from the show's legacy while every other episode aired again and again. Then, decades later, it came back. No fanfare, no big press release, just a quiet return to a late-night marathon. So what was in this episode that made it too dangerous to show? And why does its story matter just as much today as it did back in 1964? Let's step into it. To understand why this episode was buried, you first have to understand what made The Twilight Zone so unusual to begin with. When it premiered on CBS in October 1959, television was mostly a comfortable medium. Sitcoms, westerns, variety shows. Rod Serling, the show's creator and the voice behind its narration, had come out of live television drama, where he'd already learned a hard lesson about what networks would and wouldn't allow. A few years earlier, he'd written a teleplay inspired by the real-life murder of Emmett Till, a black teenager killed in Mississippi in 1955. By the time network executives and sponsors finished sanitizing that script, the story had been stripped of its racial context entirely. Serling later said the experience taught him that if he wanted to say anything honest about American life, he'd have to disguise it. Robots, aliens, time travel, parallel dimensions. Wrap the truth in science fiction, and somehow it slipped past the censors who'd never allow the same idea in a straightforward drama. That's the trick The Twilight Zone pulled off for 5 seasons. It let Serling smuggle real anxieties past network gatekeepers, Cold War paranoia, the threat of nuclear war, conformity, prejudice, the fragile line between civilization and savagery, all disguised as fantasy. Sponsors were far less nervous about a story set on a strange planet than they were about a story set in their own backyard, even when the underlying point was identical. For most of its run, this approach worked. Episodes like Time Enough at Last or The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street delivered sharp social commentary and became classics precisely because audiences could absorb the message without ever feeling directly accused. But there was one episode where the disguise wasn't thick enough, or maybe it wasn't a disguise at all. It was called The Encounter, and it aired only once, on May 1, 1964, near the very end of the show's 5th and final season. The premise is deceptively small. 2 men, 1 room, no monsters, no spaceships, nothing supernatural in the traditional sense. Neville Brand plays Fenton, a bitter, unemployed World War II veteran going through his cluttered attic. Among the junk, he finds an old Japanese katana, a sword he took as a trophy during the war. Into this scene walks a young Japanese-American man named Arthur Takamori, played by George Takei in one of his earliest television roles, years before he'd become known worldwide as Sulu on Star Trek. Arthur has come looking for odd jobs, tipped off by a neighbor. Fenton, gruff but oddly eager for company, invites him up to share a beer. What starts as small talk curdles fast. Fenton begins reminiscing about the war, about the men he killed, about how he came to own that sword. As the conversation goes on, his easy manner slips, and something colder and angrier takes its place. Arthur, meanwhile, becomes increasingly unsettled by the blade itself, almost as if it's pulling something out of him against his will. Eventually, he admits something devastating, that his father worked near Pearl Harbor and, according to Arthur, secretly passed information to the Japanese Navy before the attack. It's an accusation with no historical basis whatsoever. No evidence has ever suggested that any Japanese American aided the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans that followed the attack was built on exactly that kind of baseless suspicion. Yet within the story, once the confession is out, it can't be taken back. The 2 men, pushed by guilt, grief, and rage that neither of them fully understands, spiral toward a violent, tragic ending that leaves them both destroyed. When it aired, the reaction was immediate and severe. Complaints poured in, many from the Japanese-American community, who were understandably furious that a national broadcast had invented and dramatized exactly the kind of unfounded wartime treachery that had been used to justify locking their families behind barbed wire less than a generation earlier. The episode arrived at an especially raw moment. American troops were being sent into Vietnam in growing numbers, and a story built around old wartime hostility toward an Asian enemy landed very differently than Serling likely intended. Rather than defend the episode, CBS made a decision that had never been made for any other installment of the series. When The Twilight Zone was packaged for syndication later that decade, the encounter was left out entirely. It became the only original episode of the entire 156-episode run to be formally withheld from American syndication because of its content. Interestingly, it wasn't pulled everywhere. Canadian broadcasters aired it in reruns without incident, but in the United States, it effectively disappeared from television for the next 52 years. That's a strange kind of erasure, because the episode didn't vanish completely. Copies existed on later home video collections once VHS and DVD box sets came around, so devoted fans could technically still find it if they went looking. But it was absent from the reruns and marathons that shaped how most people experienced the show, absent from the cultural memory that other episodes built up decade after decade. If you grew up watching The Twilight Zone in syndication, on cable, or through late-night reruns, there's a real chance you never once encountered the encounter, while episodes with a fraction of its emotional weight played on a loop. It finally returned to American television on January 3, 2016, when SYFY aired the full episode as part of a New Year's marathon, airing all 156 episodes of the original series back-to-back. There was no dramatic announcement, no special introduction explaining why it had been missing for so long. It simply appeared in its place in the sequence, the way it always should have. Since then, it's been included in later home releases and is available through modern streaming platforms alongside the rest of the series, which means, more than half a century after it was quietly buried, anyone can now watch it. So why does an episode like this still matter? And why is it worth revisiting instead of leaving it forgotten? Partly because of who was standing in that attic. George Takei wasn't just an actor reciting lines about wartime injustice. He had lived it. As a small child, Takei and his family were forced from their home in Los Angeles and sent to an internment camp in Arkansas, one of 10 such camps the U.S. government built to hold Japanese Americans during the war, the majority of them, like Takei, American citizens who had committed no crime and were never charged with one. He was 5 years old when armed soldiers came to remove his family. He has spoken many times since about that experience, about watching his parents lose everything they'd built, about growing up under armed guards simply because of his ancestry. That history didn't just shape his identity, it shaped decades of his public advocacy on civil rights. Which makes his role in the encounter almost unbearably layered. Here was a man who had personally survived the exact kind of racial suspicion the episode dramatizes, playing a character forced to confess to the very kind of treachery that suspicion had always falsely accused Japanese Americans of. Whether Arthur's confession in the story is meant to be read as literal truth, a lie born of trauma, or something the character has been made to believe about himself, the episode never fully resolves it, and that ambiguity is part of what made it so uncomfortable to broadcast in 1964, and part of what makes it so uncomfortable to watch even now. It's worth being honest about the episode's flaws, too, because pretending the encounter is a flawless lost masterpiece would be its own kind of dishonesty. Modern critics and viewers have pointed out that by inventing a fictional act of Japanese-American espionage tied to Pearl Harbor, the episode risks reinforcing the exact racist myth that fueled internment in the first place, even if Serling's intent was to explore guilt and trauma on both sides. Presenting Fenton's very real war crime alongside a completely fabricated betrayal creates an uneasy, and arguably unfair, symmetry between the two characters. That tension is part of why the episode has never been treated as one of the show's finest hours, even by people who think it deserves to be seen. It's a flawed, uncomfortable piece of television, not a perfect one, and understanding why it was controversial requires holding both of those truths at once. That CBS's decision to quietly bury it for 52 years wasn't really about protecting audiences from something dangerous, and that the episode's handling of its subject matter genuinely earned criticism, then and now. Rod Serling wasn't shy about writing morally uncomfortable stories. He built an entire career on refusing to give audiences easy villains and easy comfort. What set the encounter apart wasn't just its subject matter, but how directly it confronted a wound that, in 1964, the country had barely begun to acknowledge, let alone apologize for. It would take until 1988, 24 years after this episode aired, and 46 years after the internment camps first opened, for the United States government to formally apologize. That apology came through the Civil Liberties Act, signed into law by President Ronald Reagan, which acknowledged that the internment had been driven by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, not any genuine security threat. Survivors received a formal apology and modest compensation, but no signature on a piece of legislation can undo lived experience. It doesn't erase what it felt like to be 5 years old and watch armed guards take your home away. That's part of why The Encounter, for all its imperfections, still resonates. It dramatizes something history books tend to describe from a distance: what it actually feels like to carry violence and suspicion inside you long after the event that caused it, and how that weight gets passed down, distorted, and reenacted in ways the people carrying it don't always understand themselves. The katana Fenton keeps in his attic isn't just a war souvenir. It functions almost like a symbol for something neither man can put down, a kind of inherited damage that belongs to both of them, even though they experienced the war from opposite sides of it. There's also a reason this story doesn't feel like a relic locked in 1964. In recent years, there's been a well-documented rise in anti-Asian harassment and violence in the United States, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Asian Americans, including people with no connection whatsoever to the pandemic's origin, were blamed, targeted, and in some tragic cases, assaulted or killed simply because of how they looked. It's a grim echo of the same pattern the episode is built around: fear and suspicion directed at an entire community because of the actions of a government thousands of miles away. Watching The Encounter today doesn't feel like watching a dated curiosity. It feels uncomfortably familiar, which is exactly the kind of discomfort Serling built his career on generating. The Encounter wasn't the only episode of The Twilight Zone that disappeared from view, even if it was the only one banned specifically for its content. When the show's original run ended in 1964 and CBS assembled its syndication package for local television stations, 5 episodes were left out entirely. Along with The Encounter, these included Miniature, starring a young Robert Duvall as a lonely man who becomes fixated on a dollhouse exhibit he believes is somehow alive; A Short Drink from a Certain Fountain, about an aging man whose younger wife pushes him toward an experimental youth serum with consequences he doesn't anticipate; and Sounds and Silences, about a man obsessed with loud noise who slowly loses his grip on reality. Unlike The Encounter, these 3 weren't held back because of controversial content. They were caught up in plagiarism lawsuits filed around the time the syndication deal was finalized, claims from outside writers that elements of these scripts had been lifted from material they'd submitted and had rejected. Rather than risk legal exposure, CBS simply left all 3 out of circulation. It wasn't until a 1983 anniversary television special, hosted by actor Patrick O'Neill, who had starred in A Short Drink from a Certain Fountain, that these 3 episodes were finally reintroduced to television audiences, roughly 2 decades after their original broadcasts. The 5th missing episode had an entirely different story behind it. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge wasn't written by Serling or his regular writing team at all. It was a French short film, directed by Robert Enrico and adapted from an Ambrose Bierce short story about a Confederate sympathizer's final moments before execution. The film had already won major international recognition, including the Academy Award for Best Live-Action Short Film and top honors at the Cannes Film Festival, before CBS licensed it to air as a special episode during the show's 5th season in 1964. But that license only covered a single broadcast. Once it aired, the rights reverted, and the episode dropped out of circulation for years, occasionally resurfacing on home video, but never becoming part of the show's regular rerun rotation the way most other episodes did. Put together, these 5 episodes tell a bigger story about how television history gets written, and how much of it comes down to decisions made by executives worried about lawsuits, sponsors, and controversy rather than any judgment about artistic quality. 4 of the 5 came back relatively quickly once legal issues were resolved. Only The Encounter stayed missing from American syndication for over 5 decades, and the reason wasn't a copyright dispute or a contractual technicality. It was a network deciding that a story about racial guilt and wartime trauma was simply too uncomfortable to keep showing to the public, even on a series that had built its entire reputation on discomfort. The debate underneath all of this hasn't actually gone away, it's just changed venues. 60 years ago, the question was which episodes made it into a syndication package.